I'm very pleased to be on stage with Siva Vaidhyanathan, Gennie Gebhart, and Danny O'Brien. And we're going to be looking at some of the things that really don't concern anybody, because we're not living in a digital life. We are in an analog life in the 21st century. And of course, I'm being facetious, because everything we do involves in some way an electronic device in our daily lives in the United States today. And we're very fortunate in that all three of our guests have spent a fair amount of time thinking about the implications of what our digital lives mean, the incursions into our privacy, the implications in our democracy, our political life, really everything. And so, but we're going to start tonight by turning to Siva, who has recently written a book, and the title may give away his orientation, but it's Antisocial Media: How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy. And that's a fairly provocative title. And so why don't you give us a sense of what it is you're asserting here in the book, and then we'll riff off of that, because we really have some folks who have given a fair amount of thought to these very issues.
Yeah. Look, if you sat down with a bunch of authoritarian leaders or nationalist movement leaders and you said, let's create a system through which they can distribute propaganda, they can monitor the activities of their citizens, they can undermine efforts to criticize them or challenge them, and they can maintain power or gain power, largely by distracting citizens, fracturing citizen movements and interest, and generally making citizens feel hopeless. You could not do better than to invent Facebook. And that's exactly what we've seen. Not that Facebook was invented to do any of that, but in the past 5 years, maybe 6 years, we have seen authoritarian leaders and nationalist movements around the world hijack Facebook for just those purposes. That's where we are in 2018. That's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we see Republican and Democratic forms of government being rolled back, being undermined, being threatened on every continent. It is a process of amplification. Most of these problems, most of these challenges precede Facebook, of course. Facebook didn't cause them or invite them. But these movements took full advantage of a system that was built on idealism, built on clouds, built in clouds, like we often call it the cloud, right? And that was part of the problem. There was no sense in the long story of Facebook that it might be subject to hijacking, that people might be bad to each other, that all varieties of human cruelty could be exacerbated by Facebook. And even though many of these phenomena have been visible for 4, 5, 6 years, Facebook itself was unwilling to confront these problems until 2017. And most people in this country were not paying close enough attention to these series of problems until at least late 2016. November 2016, to be exact. Okay, why? Well, look, there are three aspects of Facebook that make Facebook Facebook. Number one is scale. From the beginning, Facebook had a universalizing goal. It was supposed to connect the world. And by connecting the world, that means reaching as many parts of the world as possible, in as many languages as possible, and enrolling as many people as possible in the Facebook activities available to them, and to encourage them to use Facebook for as many things in their daily lives as possible for as much time as possible. As a result, it's been spectacularly successful. Scale, again, 2.2 billion people use Facebook. That's actually a conservative number. It was a good number as of February of 2018. By now it might be 2.26, 2.27. By December 31st, it might be 2.3 billion. The growth is in those parts of the world with a whole lot of young people and a whole lot of economic growth. Places like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico. That's really important to remember. So scale. And when we think about fixing Facebook, pushing Facebook to behave differently, remember, we have to come up with responses that can make a difference over 2.2 billion people in more than 100 languages. That's daunting. The second aspect of Facebook that we have to keep in mind is its algorithmic amplification function. Facebook's algorithm, so what it feeds to you in your news feed, encourage and reward us when we post items that generate strong emotions. So what generates strong emotions? Well, baby pictures and puppy pictures and hate speech and conspiracy theories and calls to genocide and wacky posts about all sorts of things. But well thought out, well researched, well argued, measured interventions in the world could not do worse on Facebook. They sink like a stone. If you were to post something from The Economist tonight, something about how the Italian coalition government is challenging monetary policy in the European Union, and how, Germany's very uncomfortable by that, right? Let's just say The Economist ran a story like that. And you thought it was really interesting, you posted it on your Facebook page. You might have a few friends in Germany, a few friends in Italy, a few friends who work for international banks who think it's interesting, and they might click like on it. They might even comment. They might share it. But we're talking about a handful of people. Really a handful of people. And it's just not going to travel around all of your Facebook friends. Your uncle, your cousin, they're unlikely to see this post. It's too reasonable. But if you post some wacky thing about how vaccines cause autism, and you would immediately have all of your friends comment on it. Now, if you're like me, most of your friends are going to say, this is totally out of line, it's totally unjustified, here are a bunch of links to the Centers for Disease Control, here are a bunch of mainstream media debunkings of this claim, all that kind of stuff, right? All that arguing with the original post, meant to challenge it, deflate it, knock it down, do just the opposite on Facebook. In real life, in a room like this, if I say something that wacky, you can counter me and convince everyone in the room that I'm wrong. That's how we do things. That's how we've been taught to do things from the beginning. But on Facebook, just the opposite happens. All of those comments meant to knock down the crazy stuff amplify the crazy stuff, because Facebook doesn't know that those comments are knocking it down. Facebook just counts those comments as engagement. Engagement includes clicks, shares, likes, and comments, but comments matter more than anything. So you cannot argue with the crazy on Facebook. You can only amplify the crazy. And that's just not how we're trained to behave. Anytime you see something that drives you crazy on Facebook, the best way to make sure it doesn't affect anybody is to ignore it. But, oh man, that's hard, right? That's really hard to do. So that's the second thing. So scale and algorithmic amplification. And the third thing is advertising. Facebook's advertising system not only drives everything about Facebook and enables that scale and enables the service to be constantly moving and creating and growing and dynamic, etc. But it allows for advertisers to very carefully and accurately target core audiences, very small segments of audiences, as small as 20. And you can target them, pick them out by location, by gender, by religion, by educational level, by income, by interests. You know, the big challenge for advertising for a century and a half has been, how do you run an ad, pay for an ad to try to sell dog food and not show it to cat people? And vice versa, right? That was a big, why waste money trying to sell dog food to cat people? Why waste money trying to sell pickup trucks to people who will never buy a pickup truck? Or Budweiser to people who only drink wine? That was the big mystery. How do you not waste money? Well, Google and then Facebook solved this problem by making sure if you advertise on Google, you advertise on Facebook, you're going to be pretty sure that the only people who see your ad are the very people you meant to see your ad. Now, so this is doing two things. One, it's sucking away all the money from other industries that depend on advertising, much of which we depend on for journalism. So that's a whole other problem. But beyond that, if you want to sell shoes, if you want to sell dog food, you can't do better than Facebook. If you want to sell political candidates, you also can't do better than Facebook. And if you want to sell messages, you want to spark a movement, you want to anger people, you want to divide people, Facebook's advertising platform is just as effective. But unlike buying a television ad for a political candidate, there's no accountability. If one candidate buys a television ad to attack another one, or even some supporter of that candidate does, there's a record of that ad, and people who were not intended to see that ad, and if that ad makes outlandish claims or unfair accusations, there can be a response. There can be a response through journalism. There can be a response by the other campaign. We've been seeing this battle go on, through television commercials for years. But through Facebook, there's no accountability because the other campaign might never know that ad ever ran. There is no central place where one can find it, or at least there hasn't been. In recent months, Facebook has actually created such a system, but it wasn't the case for many years, including in 2016. But more than that, you can flood a political race with all sorts of outlandish accusations and change them slightly every day or every hour to see what works. And again, there's very little chance of response or oversight or accountability. So these three things, the scale of Facebook, which is awesome. I mean, really, think about the zeros. Think about the commas in 2.2 billion. The algorithmic amplification and the advertising system. If you take any of those away from Facebook, it is no longer Facebook. But those are the source of all of these meltdowns that we've seen, all of these controversies that we've seen with Facebook in the last 3 years, from election interference to the meltdown of dumping all that data, behavioral data, to Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm, nefarious former political consulting firm out of England, and all the other problems Facebook has generated. All of these things are a function of these aspects of Facebook. These are not examples of Facebook failing. They're examples of Facebook succeeding as designed. The problem with Facebook is Facebook.
Well, that's a fairly provocative, but a very, but really a wonderful overview of the systemic functioning of this organism, digital organism that is global, that is pervasive, that is affecting our daily lives. And thankfully on stage, we have a couple of individuals who also work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And they're going to tell us whether this is a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, so it's funny because the entire setup feels like now I'm going to have to come in and defend Facebook, and I'm of course going to do no such thing. Perhaps we should create a hand puppet that can stand for Facebook in this, or a fake account of some kind. So my background to this is that, as was mentioned before, I've been involved in sort of defending individuals and communities who've faced censorship or surveillance as a result of new technologies, as well as, of course, of defending the opportunities that new technologies provide for civil liberties. And I think I first encountered in the day job Facebook I think it must have been 2008 and 2009, where we were contacted by a Hong Kong opposition group. And for those of you who've been following the story of Hong Kong in the last decade, it's been one of a move from some optimism that the democratic structures might set an example for the rest of China, to one where there's been an increasing sort of targeting of institutions and democratic activists. In 2008, what had happened is that Hong Kong had discovered, like much of the rest of the world, Facebook, and an opposition group had developed started a Facebook group that I think was, even at that time, in the tens of thousands. And it was a much smaller Facebook that they were dealing with. And one day, Facebook just deleted that group. And the consequences of that are actually astounding, because those are a group of people who, with Mark Zuckerberg's promise, had found something that they might not have been able to talk about. They were connected with others, and they were beginning to participate and organize and debate. And if a group like that is deleted, they don't see each other again. They're thrown to the winds. A very similar thing happened when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists in the very beginnings of the Arab Spring, and in particular the few key moments that led to the uprising in Egypt. I believe it must have been around about this time. It was close to Thanksgiving. And we got a note, actually it was on Thanksgiving itself, because that's why it ended up with me. I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. It's not part of my culture. We had word that the same thing had happened, that We Are Khalid Saeed, which was the main group that was organizing, and this was before the truly large protests had happened, but was already in 200,000 or so members, had just been deleted. So we were in the position of trying to contact people at Facebook informally to restore that, and to their credit, they did. They realized their mistake. They had deleted it because the administrator of that group was anonymous, and anonymity is not permitted on Facebook. The fact that that person was anonymous for extremely good reasons under the Mubarak regime was neither here nor there for Facebook. But what I think all of those events brought home a couple of things for me. One is the amazing opaqueness to and arbitrariness of what Facebook did. It was both an enabler of these incredible political movements, but it could also make them disappear overnight. The second thing is how American-centric Facebook's view of the world was. And I really don't blame anyone in that situation. In 2008 or 2010, Facebook had drawn a straight line between being something for connecting people in American universities to on its way to being the same system for 2 billion people. But I think both of the challenges in recognizing the problems of Facebook and of devising solutions often stumble upon this idea. We were talking earlier about how Facebook announced that it's election war room today. And very pointedly, I think that election war room was announced, and it's basically where they sit there and try and do something to prevent malicious manipulation of election messaging. And this is aimed to a US audience that's concerned about the November elections. And we were sort of kicking around the idea, does this war room kick up every time there's an election? Does it kick up every time there's a European election? Does it kick up every time there's a county election? I mean, I think that there's probably an election going on every week around the world, and is Facebook responsible for all of those? But more importantly, we realized that the conversation that they were having was like, well, don't worry, we practiced on some other countries before now. And this is something that I think we've heard before. I think that I've definitely seen headlines where people have said, my democracy is not your experimental lab. And this is clearly the case with Facebook and Twitter, I would say, and many of these other services, that they have taken upon themselves an incredible responsibility and claimed an authority of a system that we don't even trust democracy to, right? We don't yet trust the world to a centralized democratic control, because we recognize perhaps we're just not sophisticated enough to know create a system that is equally good for someone in the farthest corners of southern India and someone in Moscow, right? And that's what Facebook and Twitter and all of these companies are attempting to achieve. And our feeling is that's a huge challenge. And it may well be impossible. We may have to come up with solutions that aren't Facebook-shaped, but they definitely need help, right? They definitely need more than just a few people in a war room trying to work out how to do this. And unless we and they face up to that huge responsibility and challenge, we're just going to hit more and more of these problems.
Gennie, you think about these things. You've spent time in some of these countries that we've been experimenting with, or that Facebook has been experimenting with, wondering whether or not they can manage the speech that is that is affecting perhaps political processes. What have you found? You've been in Southeast Asia a fair amount, is that right?
Yeah, that's where most of my expertise is. But I think the first thing, while keeping the focus aimed straight at Facebook, I always think when we have these conversations, when there's Facebook headlines, every other company in Silicon Valley is breathing a sigh of relief because Facebook is taking the flak for the practices that they all share. Facebook is just the biggest and the baddest, or the best, like depending on how you feel about extractive surveillance. Facebook is the best at it because of that scale that Siva mentioned. It is, and that scale powers better or worse, again, depending on how you feel about the well-being of humans in democracy, better or worse algorithms, and more lucrative advertising. So I think that's the first thing that I always come back to. We're focusing on Facebook because in so many ways it's the superlative, but in no way is it the only company or entity experimenting with and manipulating these different algorithmic methods. As far as looking internationally, I think not only has Facebook kind of, as Danny said, kind of treated other sovereign nations' elections as an experiment for the upcoming US elections. Also Facebook, and what I've looked at in a lot of my research is how Facebook has tried many different strategies to grab more and more eyeballs from various developing countries, people who are coming online for the first time, people who might be interested in Facebook who were not before, releasing new languages, and how that's often couched in kind of a philanthropic, connecting the unconnected kind of approach. What I'm thinking of in particular is Free Basics and Internet.org, kind of the initiative within Facebook that is neither the internet nor a nonprofit, trying to, as they say, connect the unconnected. But when you look at kind of the programs in practice, and when you look at the transcripts of shareholder calls, it is another way to grow. It's another way to keep increasing that scale. I think it has been successful in growing Facebook's audience. Whether or not it has been successful in connecting the unconnected in any philanthropic or do-gooding sense is much more up to debate.
Right. Okay, so, but you know, it's interesting because you talked about some of these other companies. Why, and maybe I'm opening this up to anyone here, why, if Google, for example, is a platform that many of us visit dominantly for search, but maybe for other things as well, why doesn't that have the algorithmic scale or amplification or even some of the surveillance that you're suggesting exists that we attribute dominantly to Facebook?
Well, since I wrote the book on Facebook, I'll answer in the most cynical ways, because in 2011 I published my book on Google. So that's and in 2011 I tried to warn us that this level of massive surveillance and our increasing dependence on Google was structuring the way we see the world. It was structuring how we get around the world. It was structuring what we think is true and good and important. And that was laying a tremendous amount of power on one company that had been around at that point for about 13 years. And that, to me, was bizarre. It was worrisome. I did not anticipate, by 2011, what has really emerged, which is the power of YouTube. The power of YouTube as the most influential director and pusher of video being, in many ways, the most persuasive propaganda tool available to us, as even the Nazis knew, and therefore something that probably should be handled with care. YouTube has a very toxic recommendation engine, so that if you go to search for something that seems fairly benign, YouTube will steadily recommend more extreme versions of the same thing. If you go onto YouTube to watch videos of people playing video games, which is something many 12-year-old boys are doing at this very moment, you will soon, within 4 or 5 videos, be directed to misogynistic messages. Because those communities traffic in misogynistic messages, and the patterns of interaction get reinforced by YouTube. It's a really dangerous propaganda machine. So let me put it in numerical scale here. Facebook has 2.2 billion users, regular monthly active users. YouTube has 1.6 billion. Both those numbers are huge. If I were to write the Googleization of everything and publish it this year, YouTube would have led it off as the big thing to worry about. But I already published that book. I had another book to write. Okay. But it's definitely, it should be part of our conversation. Again, 2.2 billion for Facebook, 1.6 billion for YouTube. Next in line among social media services in the world is Wechat, which is used almost exclusively in the People's Republic of China, or in the diaspora of the People's Republic of China. And it has about 1.2 billion users. It's difficult to get a clean number from Wechat, but that's a pretty good guess by most people in the industry right now. Then there's another service that's available in China called QQ. That's also in the list of the top 4 or 5. But right up there is Instagram. And then WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. And all of them are hovering between about 800 million and 1 billion people as regular monthly active users. Now, it turns out Facebook, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp are all owned by Facebook. So think about it. The lowest number I just mentioned is 800 million. Twitter has 300 million monthly active user accounts. Only 300 million. Now, a few years ago, that was a big number. It's no longer. It's also pretty much flatlined. Twitter has not grown in years. Twitter has yet to make a dime. Those 300 million accounts, I said accounts because we don't know how many of them are actually human beings. Twitter's also influential in Western Europe and North America and doesn't really have much everyday penetration in the rest of the world. It's one of the reasons I don't consider Twitter to be particularly important. Don't tell the president. It is important in the sense that when the president of the United States puts something on Twitter, every journalist in the world is following him on Twitter, and therefore whatever he sends out there echoes around mainstream media and then ultimately ends up on Facebook because it's all connected, right? All of these services are part of one large ecosystem that allow for YouTube videos to be shared to Facebook, for Facebook posts to turn into tweets, for lots of tweets to feed into mainstream media, which then, if Sean Hannity sees a tweet that interests him, it'll turn into a rant, and then Sean Hannity's rant will echo around Facebook. It'll also be seen by the president every night and then retweeted. So, that it's a weird cycle. It's a weird ecosystem. So all of these services are relevant, but Facebook is so much more important than all the rest, with the possible exception of Google, and that's largely because of largely because of YouTube. But again, that was a book I already wrote.
By the way, this talk will be on YouTube, just so in case you were wondering.
Oh, you think?
Yeah, well, yes. But I was going to say, I'm very glad that Ask Jeeves was not on that list because, that was one of the ones I'm least worried about. But anyway, Denny, I interrupted you.
Because I think that we spend a lot of time worrying about this, but in many ways it's very challenging to try and put a structure on this. I think it's actually an interesting question about why we're particularly concerned about Facebook compared to these other internet giants. And I think one of the things that I'd like to paint is how Facebook arrived on the scene. Before Facebook happened, I think most people would have thought and framed a lot of these discussions as companies on the internet, that there was a substrate beneath these companies that depending on how technical you were, depending how interested you were in the development of these new technologies, people had some say in, right? You could put up a website and you could dictate what you wanted on that website. And a company that started in one place had very little to compare it to a company starting in another. And all of these things also were largely public. The internet was commensurate with the idea of speaking publicly. So one of the things that I think Google grew on was benefiting from that commons, that public commons. And so to a certain degree, there was an element of transparency about what it did, and also a sense of alternative. Google's arguments all the time were, we can't really have a monopoly because you could just click and go to Bing. At one point, Google even listed its competitors at the bottom, which I think if it had kept that up, it might have had a better chance of facing off the EU recently, but that's by the by. But what's interesting is that Facebook emerged because actually people don't want to live their lives in public. People want privacy, and they want the shared privacy of their friends and neighbors. They don't want everything that they say to their friends and everything that they say to their family to be stored forever on the internet and searchable by Google's handy search index. And so that was a really powerful offering when Facebook began. And the sort of devil's deal is that now for really the first time, you can easily share with just a narrow and small group of people and Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg is everybody's friend on Facebook and gets to see all that data. And so I think it's actually the shock of discovering that intimacy could be turned against us, which has made the discussions about Facebook so emotional. Just to widen out the context just a little bit more, because I think we have to put this into a wider context. First of all, we've gone through these kind of challenges with media before. Radio was not only an enabler of huge democratic movements, but also an enabler of far right-wing takeovers in the 20s and 30s, partly because we didn't know the full emotional effect of having FDR speak from his fireplace or Adolf Hitler speaking his speeches to the world. And before that, same with newspapers, same with the early media in the American Revolution. So we have some familiarity with how the world shakes when new technology and new media arises. But the other thing is that this isn't the only. For everything we say about Facebook is still part of an ecosystem. It's perhaps weakened the internet part of the ecosystem. But for all the discussion about how messaging has been spread through Facebook, it's also been spread through the mass media. Mm-hmm. The very fact that our current president tweets and everybody who's a journalist reads those tweets and magnifies through the traditional press and the traditional media is something I think we have to pay attention to. This is both new in a very familiar and old way, and also something that we have to bear in mind is part of a bunch of stuff that none of us would think of as new media.
Gennie, why don't you comment on that and anything else you've heard, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I did want to comment on this fact of amplification radicalization. I think that is where one of the key tensions is in just kind of the extractive surveillance business model that all of the major internet companies have adopted. And that's this tension between content that promotes engagement, that promotes clicks and likes and eyeballs on the screen, which is the revenue driver. The tension between that and the fact that that content is perhaps the most harmful to people and to democracies and to social systems. And I think Kamala Harris at a recent Senate hearing actually stumped a very composed Sheryl Sandberg, an executive at Facebook, stumped her with this question of, how are you going to resolve that tension? Like, how can you convince us that out of the good of Facebook's heart, it is going to give up on that revenue? It's not a thing that makes sense in the logic of that business model. And I think it's the same for YouTube, it's the same for Twitter. Anything that is an algorithmic model trying to show you things to keep you on the site. That is optimized for clicks, it is not optimized for any kind of health. So I think that is the tension that has yet to be resolved, and might be one of the reasons that kind of the question at organizations like EFF that are watching this, the question has gone from, I wonder if regulation is going to be necessary, to, it looks like regulation is coming. In the US at least. So I think that is a huge question that we're going to see a lot of different answers to in the near future.
We see it as tension. Senator Harris sees it as tension. Sheryl Sandberg doesn't see it as tension. Neither does Mark Zuckerberg.
Hence they're being stumped.
To them it was never zero sum. To them, the more people who used Facebook, the better those people would be. The more hours you spent on Facebook, the better your life would be. You would build community. You would make new friends. Food would taste better. All sorts of good things would spread from that, right? That was the true belief. And it's what justified the maximization of Facebook use, Facebook penetration into various markets around the world. They wouldn't even call them markets. They were just new audiences, right? New members of Facebook. And so they've never seen a distinction between what was good for Facebook and what was good for humanity until just now.
Mm-hmm. That really leads to this first question from the audience, which is about these members or communities or audiences. And the question is really about some of the most vulnerable members of those audiences. And the questioner asks, what are your thoughts as to how minors are using social media, and to what extent are companies protecting minors?
Good. Jenny, do you have ideas?
You all want to jump into that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jen.
I can speak a bit. In particular, I've worked on student privacy. So this is about how not only are minors using social media, they're using them in what was previously the sacred space of the school, right? In terms of information privacy in particular, there are certain spaces in our lives that have been sacred, kind of legally and ethically and socially. They include the home, right? The hospital or the doctor's office, and the school, a place where privacy will be beneficial for creativity, for feeling safe to take risks. It is arguably necessary for learning. But increasingly, for better or for worse, a lot of schools are taking the perhaps good bargain of you can get all these great shiny Chromebooks and different kinds of educational technology and just trade in a whole lot of perhaps federally protected educational information. So there's a lot going on there, but the big thing that I see there that is also a trend in homes, with home assistants, in different parts of our lives is that there's this increasing socialization of accepting that bargain, that it makes sense and it is good and right for me to hand over my soul in exchange for good software. And I think what's so frightening about students using that technology is that it's teaching kids from a young age in what should be one of the safest places in their lives that this is okay and this is normal and this is how you get access to good, convenient, enjoyable uses of technology. And in the bigger picture, especially about Facebook and recent privacy data breaches and other headlines, that should not be the trade-off you have to make. You should not have to hand over all of your information and your soul in order to use the most popular social networks and technological services in the world.
Or even just be a social person.
Exactly.
Be an educated person. Right.
Exactly, and that's even the bargain that schools have had to make. Chromebooks and other software are expensive, but all of a sudden, if you allow different kinds of access, they're free. So this is really a devil's bargain, and it's what I always come back to is it is not inevitable. It's not inevitable. That is the only way that a tech company could possibly make money. But
it's also not the only way we have to run education, right? So,
yes.
So many of these maladies that we see or excesses that we see are a function of the fact that we have retreated from public commitments to basic civic functions like public education, like publicly run prisons. There are so many examples in our lives over the past 40 years where we have rolled back the public commitment and we've seen companies rush in to solve the problem. It's a phenomenon I call public failure in contrast to market failure, which justified the public broadcasting system. The market was not going to give us opera. The market was not going to give us children's television that was educational. So public television came in to fill the gap that markets failed to fill. Well, we don't talk about market failure anymore. We talk about public failure, a failure that we created, right? So we roll back support to the point where schools are desperate for any handout they can get, and we applaud when they bring in these devices that don't actually let the students get inside of them, right? Mm-hmm. The students aren't allowed to pop open the Chromebook and take out the motherboard, right? Add a little RAM. Like, that's not something they could do. I could do it when I was in high school. The computers in my computer lab were completely customizable. And we learned a lot about how this stuff worked. And we learned how to code, with a command line. I mean, in my day, right? I don't want to play that game. But look, the fact is these educational technologies are not designed to educate. They are designed to acculturate students to be digital consumers and to have a certain comfort level with these digital interfaces, and that creates norms and expectations and values that are not necessarily in the realm of education.
There's another part of this as well, which is a complicated idea. But I was interested in the structure of the question because it was saying, what is Facebook, what are these social media platforms doing to protect minors? And I think that sort of assumes that of the platter of ways that we can protect people or empower people, we should choose the menu and the capabilities that companies like Facebook have to offer. And that's worrying to me because, there's a particular approach to communication that Facebook offers, and that's through surveillance and algorithmic choice and a sort of strange conflation of, as I said, the private and the public, the social and the political and the personal. And, one of the things that the internet and other communication technologies provide to kids is partly educational. It's partly what we want in a sort of public discussion, but it's also very personal and private, that as a child develops, they also need room to explore and find those things themselves. So often the solutions to protecting children revolve around, for instance, I've seen Microsoft and other companies offer services that will enable you to sort of track everything your child is doing online. And I understand the argument for that. But there's a couple of things. There's very little restraint in the same way as we find it very hard to restrain what Mark Zuckerberg or Google sees of our work, right? There isn't a private space in that. And when we teach our children that it's acceptable to hand the power over to a company and strip away all privacy, we're not teaching that child to be empowered. We're teaching them to be compliant with a pervasive surveillance system.
So Mark Zuckerberg is the elf on the shelf.
Yeah.
So Dan from the audience has a question. Has anyone calculated how much money the companies make from every average user, so per user value? And the reason he asks this is he says this would allow us to, quote, buy our privacy.
Right.
A horrible accommodation, but essential for political freedom.
Yeah.
And so then he concludes by saying, freedom will require some very private committees of correspondence.
Okay. So yes, the answer is yes. I don't have those numbers in my head right now, but suffice it to say that, unsurprisingly, American Facebook users are the most valuable, per minute, per day, per month to Facebook. However, that gap is closing, as you might imagine, right? So largely because we have the reserve currency of the world, that we get this kind of financial power in all things. But look, there are 220 million Facebook users in the United States. That is pretty much flatlined. There are 250 million Facebook users in India, and that is only a quarter of the population of India. So let's keep that in mind. And over time, if India continues to grow at between 6% and 9% GDP per year, which it has for the last 20 years, there's a good chance that that gap is going to close over the next 20 years. Now, if you want to talk about having a price for which we would pay Facebook and therefore opt out of surveillance, Facebook has to agree to that, right? And Facebook's going to look at that and say, well, why would we do that? We already make the money. Like, what's in it for us, right? Facebook runs the show, right? You can't force it to accept money when it doesn't want to accept money, right? Not in this country anyway. So that's one thing. The second thing is, Mark Zuckerberg is very clear about this every time it's suggested, that not everybody can pay that price. And you might say, well, let's say the people in Uganda are worth, just making up a number, worth 4 cents per month, and people in the United States are worth $40 per month. And so we'll charge 4 cents per month in Uganda, and we'll charge $40 per month in the United States. That is a tremendously complicated system to try to manage. And again, what's in it for Facebook? So reforms like that don't quite track with what is good for Facebook. And that's fundamentally what is at the root of the problem. And that's why I say the problem with Facebook is Facebook. Most of these suggestions don't recognize the nature of Facebook, the fact that it is tremendously successful, powerful, and huge, and that it has to have some incentive to change what it does. And right now, the only incentive that seems to work on it is shame and fear. And even then, Facebook's interventions have been largely cosmetic, not because they mean them to be cosmetic, but merely because, again, the scale. You're dealing with 2.2 billion people across more than 100 languages. Almost any intervention to reform Facebook will be an edge case intervention.
Yeah, I have a quick response that's pretty short. I do have a lot of trouble with the idea of putting a price on these different really necessary platforms that are quite hard or impossible to opt out of, because I think that any solution we're working towards should recognize that privacy is not a privilege, privacy is a right. And if we codify privacy as a privilege, I think we are just extending ourselves to a whole new problem. Different kind of in letter, but very similar in nature to what we're stuck with right now.
And even if you offered it to Americans, pay $40, don't get watched, pay $0 and get watched, guess what most Americans are going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think that those sort of proportions also hit another problem with this, which is, and it's something that at EFF we've seen also with solutions that are always wrapped around intellectual property to problems on the internet, is that digital information doesn't really fit into the boxes of a good that you can price. To give an example with this idea that you can sort of buy your privacy or opt out. Well, the nature of the surveillance isn't that Mark Zuckerberg or anyone else is targeting just you individually. They're targeting everybody like you. Right. And the power that they have comes from knowing what you do compared to other people. So if you opt out, it doesn't really matter because this company, this organization knows what people like you do because they're collecting other bits of information. And you can't buy everybody else's privacy at the same time as you are. And no matter how unique I think I am, if Mark Zuckerberg knows what every other Generation X parent in my street is doing, he already has some influence and some control, not only on like what adverts I'm going to be shown, but how our whole cohort may behave and operate in the future.
Facebook also monitors individuals who are not Facebook members and individuals who are former Facebook members, largely because they have, for years, bought consumer data from the big data vendors to try to match it with Facebook data. So they already know all about you, even if you quit Facebook.
Yeah. You would think that quitting is a very clear opting out sign, but it turns out not the case.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I certainly know that it's not just Facebook or these other platforms that are familiar with everything I do. It's also true that there have been other nations that have hacked into our systems. In particular, I know that when my wife worked for the U.S. government, I had to fill out a form that told the Office of Personnel Management a great deal about myself, and that particular file has been lifted outside of the country.
I'm sorry for your loss,
Yes.
or OPM's loss at least.
Yeah. But it's not just these private companies that are headquartered in the Silicon Valley that actually are learning about us and have this data. Can we look at maybe around the world and where the threats exist elsewhere to, let's start with Americans, but to others as well?
Well, one of the things that we said to Google at the very beginning when it started collecting data, and we certainly repeatedly said to Facebook and Twitter, is you're creating a honeypot. You're creating a huge cache of data that no matter if you have the best security protections in the world, is worth so much to so many nation-state actors and other groups that it becomes worse than Fort Knox, right? You have to protect yourself against all of these different groups. And I think that's one of the things that you've seen, that it's not just a matter of states attempting to hack into either the centralized services or individual people's accounts to extract this data. I think a lot of what you've seen in this sort of state interference in the domestic politics of the United States and other countries is really just sort of like treating the social media platforms as black boxes to extract data from in other ways. And, there are probably some legitimate ways of thinking about that. I've had very interesting conversations with the digital managers of the Obama campaign, where, of course, they were extremely excited to get the kind of information and insight into the voting public that they got from using Facebook and other companies' advertising services. But I think that that's something where should give us all pause, is that we've spend a lot of time worrying about nation states getting this data by directly tapping us. But in fact, there's a huge power in either directly tapping the companies themselves or just treating them as something that can be used to extract that data with, whether it's criminally or just by using the services that they provide.
And let's be clear about this. So remember, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was about this company, this political consulting company run by Bond villains, getting data, rich data on 87 million Americans. And it was real easy to demonize, real easy to fear. They seemed to work for some of the most nefarious political actors in the world. And really, what a cast of characters, right? And they were talking about doing psychographic profiling, which ultimately doesn't work, and they didn't need to do because Facebook does it all for you. But look, they got that data because they bought it from a researcher who had created a personality quiz that ran on Facebook. And for years, people would say, oh, look, I'm going to find out something about my personality. I'm going to click all these answers. And without realizing what they were doing, because it's all in the fine print, they were allowing Facebook to learn everything about them. But beyond that, to learn everything about all their friends. So if you were friends with someone who took this personality quiz, your data got sucked out to Cambridge Analytica. And we were justifiably appalled by that when we learned the details of it in March of 2018. But between 2010 and 2015, that practice was standard practice by Facebook. Facebook gave application developers of every kind nearly full access to behavioral data on the users of those applications and all of their friends. So if you played Mafia Wars, if you played Words with Friends, if you played Farmville, you were dumping all your friends' data to those companies. And the Obama campaign in 2012 is a perfect example of this. I was one of a number of people who in 2012 was saying, you know what? Because the Obama campaign's door-to-door operation was running on a software system where you logged in with your Facebook credentials, they were able to get access to like 200 million Americans. More data, better data than Cambridge Analytica had. And by the way, fresher data, it was immediate data. Because all these people who were volunteering for Obama were logging in with Facebook credentials. And the people who worked for the Obama campaign were amazed that they got this access. They didn't really ask for it, but all of a sudden all this data came in and they couldn't stop it. And so they used it, and they used it quite effectively. And remember how we talked about, or how people wrote about the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012, how digitally savvy they were, and this was something to applaud? Well, a lot of us were saying, hey, everybody, this is a head of state who has a political operation that has the richest collection of personal details about its citizens. This is not a healthy situation for anybody. And let's put aside the fact that this particular head of state is, Barack Obama. I have voted for him twice, whatever. I don't fear the guy, but I actually probably should, because he had a lot of people working for him who were worth fearing. But look, that's just not a healthy thing in a democracy. Nobody cared in 2012. It was impossible. I tried to get reporters interested. I tried to get op-eds pitched. Nobody cared about this. It was stunning. And then Cambridge Analytica gets useless information of a lot fewer Americans, and boom, it's all over the place. This killed me, man. I was like, look, people who study social media, people who are activists in the field, we've known all this for 5, 6, 7, 10 years. We've been watching this stuff. We've been telling people the meltdown's coming, the problems are clear, the hijacking of Facebook and other services are coming. There are all kinds of problems coming, and people rolled their eyes at us and laughed at us and ignored the scholarship that kept coming out, really solid scholarship on this. I know people who are in the field in Azerbaijan talking about how the nationalist forces there are using Facebook to frighten away every possible critic of the government, using rape threats and kidnapping threats and death threats to totally wipe out opposition. And that stuff was all happening on WhatsApp and on Facebook for years, and it's all documented in peer-reviewed research. But it was impossible to get people to pay attention beyond the scholarly community and the activist community. Well, finally, we're getting the message out, right? So the fact is, we don't know who got all that data. Like, I know the Obama campaign did. I know that the company that made Words with Friends did. The company that made Farmville did. But I don't know whether the Israeli government did. I don't know whether the Turkish government did. They could have created personality quizzes. If they didn't, they were pretty stupid, right? I don't know if the Iranian government did. I don't know if the Indian government did. I don't know if the Pakistani government did. And all of these countries have an interest in having that level of surveillance over their populations. So there's a good chance that some nefarious state actors did actually create games, apps, quizzes, or whatever, and get tremendous access to people's personal information.
If I can sum up really quickly, I think a very short response to that question, right, about hacking into government systems don't pay attention to the bad guys, right? The bad guys are the headline grabbers, but it's not about the bad actors. It's about the systems that they're using. They're playing by the rules in the most dangerous things. There's headline grabbing things like, oh, they hacked the firewall, and like, whatever. But that is an extremely expensive, hard, time-consuming thing to do. And why would you do that when you can just use the system exactly as it was designed? That is the thing to pay attention to.
That's right.
And that's where the data gets stored, and that's where you
Exactly.
are able to do the surveillance. You know, it's been such an uplifting evening. But when we talked about many of these systems early on, and they first were coming out, we talked about the democratization of dialogue, the ability to organize against oppressive regimes, the opportunity to, in fact, be able to use these for Twitter revolutions and the like. Has that disappeared? Is there no longer an opportunity? I guess I'm trying to come up with something positive because otherwise I'll have to,
straight up, that was a distortion, an exaggeration, and a great disservice to the people who put their bodies on the line in Tunis and Alexandria and Port Said and Cairo. Those uprisings had multiple causes, multiple influences, multiple activist parties. They used many forms of communication, right? So to credit Facebook or credit Twitter with any of that ignores two basic facts: that almost nobody in Egypt or Tunisia was using Facebook or Twitter in 2010 and 11. Facebook had only been available in Arabic for about a year at that point. The people who were using it, by the way, were cosmopolitan, educated elites, largely in Cairo, who had connections overseas. The major Facebook activist websites were actually run outside of the country. They were run out of Lebanon. And they really didn't influence that many people to get into the streets. Why? Because most Egyptians were not on Facebook. Why? Because most Egyptians didn't have data plans on their phones. Most Egyptians used those Nokia candy bar phones that have been the workhorses of communication for 15 years now, and they're great phones. Mine still works. And it's great because you can use SMS really cheaply without a data plan. And that's, even still today, how most people in the developing world communicate, through SMS texting. That was really important. In addition to the old photocopy machine, that was really important, especially in the 5 or 6 days in Cairo when the internet was down. The thing was, people were tweeting and posting on Facebook about what was happening in Tunisia, what was happening in Egypt. So CNN and BBC were focused on Tunisia and Egypt, and they were learning about what was going on by following Twitter. So these journalists assumed that Twitter was where it was happening, not how they were learning about it, which is really what was happening there. They should have wondered, why are all these people tweeting in English? And that's really what was, they were tweeting in English so that CNN and BBC would pick it up, right? So that's an important distinction here. But also, when we think about, I don't even want to call it the Arab Spring, right? Because most of those uprisings failed terribly. Even today, only Tunisia offers any sense of optimism out of those uprisings. But those uprisings were just as strong in Morocco. They were just as strong in Lebanon. They were just as strong in Bahrain and Syria and Libya. Bahrain, Syria, and Libya turned into bloodbaths, especially Syria. All that we're seeing in Syria right now is a continuation of those uprisings. All the tweeting in the world isn't going to help you when the government opens fire. The reason that Tunisia and Egypt went one way and the rest of these countries went another is that the armies abandoned the dictator in both of those countries. Those were revolutions for what they were, largely because of decisions made by the armed forces, as opposed to the other places, like in Bahrain, where the Saudi army came in. All of that gets lost. The reasons for the uprising: Tunisia, much of it was driven by opposition to corruption. In Egypt, much of it was driven by the fact that subsidies for wheat had been rolled back by the government in a moment of austerity, thus tripling the price of bread. People were really hungry and really angry, and they found multiple reasons to come into the streets. All of that was extremely complicated, interesting, but it really came down to the corporeal, not the digital. People put their bodies on the line.
So, Siva, you're not going to give me a cause of optimism here. So,
but I'll tell you what, I can give you more pessimism from that, which is after 2011,
it gets worse.
the line that Facebook and Twitter mattered, or especially that Facebook mattered, alarmed dictators around the world. And they said, we better crack this system. Yeah. We better figure out how to work Facebook instead of falling for it. And they did. And within 2 years, they had a playbook. So when Narendra Modi ran for prime minister in India in 2014, he had the world's biggest and most elaborate Facebook campaign ever. And he has one group of troll army pushing out propaganda for him, another one pushing out propaganda against the opposition parties, and another whole group that undermines any critic, any academic, any journalist, any NGO leader, any human rights leader, with all sorts of threats and videos with heads put on other bodies and all sorts of nonsense to totally mess with the public sphere. And that playbook has been replicated by Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Yep. It's been replicated to a lesser degree even today in Italy. When the coalition government that runs Italy has a right-wing element that's called the League, formerly the Northern League, and its 40-year-old leader is the master of Facebook. He doesn't quite have the following Modi has, but he's operating in the very same context. That's what we're seeing around the world, the hijacking of Facebook. And that comes directly out of the misunderstanding of the message from 2011.
All right, so if I will wrap this up here, and then we'll open it up for a few questions afterwards. But really what I'm hearing is pour yourself a scotch, read Siva's book, and do what you can individually regarding your own democracy. Understand the power of these systems and these platforms so that you are at least operating consciously within this digital world. And thank you for coming this evening.